So, in a previous lesson, we have seen how to choose deployment methods for your endpoint machines alongside with defining your organization's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint architecture. Now, we will see what are some considerations before and after deploying agents and onboarding endpoint machines. To see that, let's focus a little bit on one thing we mentioned in one of the previous lessons, and that is service adoption order. As we told that since endpoint detection and response is most important and first in adoption order, and as such, endpoint devices are liable to use endpoint detection and response capabilities at the moment they are onboarded to Microsoft Defender solution. So endpoint detection and response is automatically first part of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution you adopt. However, you need to take care that if you already have another non-Microsoft endpoint protection solution on your machines, in that case, Defender antivirus solution run in passive mode on your machines, because that is required for endpoint detection and response to work as expected. In a case Microsoft Defender antivirus is not used as antivirus on a machine, but something else instead. Now, after you choose onboarding method and before you go on a large scale with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution deployment, you may want to sort out role-based access control to administration portal for people and IT teams who will be in charge for Defender for Endpoint solution management and administration once it will be deployed. Most simple way to assign roles that enable users to fully access all administration and configuration capabilities of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution is to give them default global administrator or security administrator roles, as we mentioned some time before. But sometimes that is not what you want. In larger organizations, and particularly in enterprises with remotely located offices in different regions, and with multiple IT persons being in a role of Security Operations Center analysts, so-called SOC analysts, it is obvious that these persons can't have global administrator role, so you will somehow need to configure appropriate access to administration portal for them as well. And there comes into consideration role-based access control, so-called RBAC. With RBAC, you can provide fine-grained permissions to users. For example, as we mentioned before, in a case when large company is divided on multiple region locations and each location has, for example, dedicated SOC analysts only for that region, then it doesn't make sense that SOC analyst from region A has access to endpoint machines in region B. With RBAC, you can make such roles that analysts from region A can see only devices from region A. On top of that, if organization is such large that on every location SOC analysts will be split into tier 1 or tier 2 support groups, where tier 1 will do basic troubleshooting and tier 2 will do advanced troubleshooting, with RBAC you can do that as well. So users managing location A will be able to see only devices in location A and will have different sets of permissions based on whether they are tier 1 or tier 2. So that is important thing to consider as well when you implement Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution. Do you have IT support team which will manage only specific sets of machines? And will they be separated in different tiers with different sets of permissions and tasks? As with every other product deployment on a large scale, it is the best to start with proof of concept, which means onboarding small number of devices to test specific Defender for Endpoint services you wish to implement in your organization, and on a different operating system platforms in case that is something you wish to do for larger number of devices in later stages of deployment. In this proof of concept, it is very important to evaluate and prove Microsoft Defender for Endpoint product capability in your environment, to avoid unpleasant surprises in later stages when larger number of endpoint devices will be onboarded, and therefore exit strategies are more complicated in case product doesn't behave in your environment as it is expected to do. After proof of concept, you can go with pilot deployment, where you will onboard larger number of devices, and besides difference in larger number of devices, this pilot stage will be different than proof of concept in terms of deployment methods. Since proof of concept's primary purpose was to evaluate product and prove that its features indeed are what your organization needs and that it works in your organization as expected. Because of that, we could use script to onboard small number of devices in proof of concept stage, but now in a pilot stage, you have to focus on trying out chosen methods to onboard devices, or to say to deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to devices. You will try, for example, Group Policy or Endpoint Configuration Manager or Intune. Now that you know after proof of concept that product satisfies your organization needs, and you have ensured that appropriate deployment and onboarding method works, it is time for production stage, where you will onboard endpoint machines to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution on organizational-wide scope. And that is how to prepare your organization for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint by identifying some key considerations, on top of the ones we already described in previous videos and sections, like networking requirements, for example, and else. In next lesson, we will take a look on overview of deployment methods to onboard devices to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution.